most blacks were opposed to affirmative action in hiring and in college admissions because they knew this would stigmatize anyone who got a job or who got admitted. But it was something for the movement to do. And they also pivoted where, it suddenly wasn't enough to have equal rights before the law. Now you had to have massive favoritism, and you also had to have massive government spending. So you started with the war on poverty and the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, and there's just been this enormous amount of money, trillions of dollars spent on the war on poverty, and it hasn't really accomplished much.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. Borrowing from Kamala Harris's affinity for Venn diagrams, how is it the intersection between the protesters, rioters, and looters at Black Lives Matter get-togethers, pro-Hamas 10 cities, and Lavender Bund Bacchanalia is nearly an identical circle? The politics of causes and boogeymen. This is sentimentality in its purest, uncut form. It's how looting gets turned into symbolic taking, and the lines between illegal interlopers and law-abiding citizens get blurred. As the appetite for political power grows, so does the need to identify marginalized groups to feed the beast. Speaking of Kamala, she provided a ham-handed but telling illustration of this back when her cackling was limited to the Senate chamber during the confirmation hearing for a nominee for Assistant Homeland Security Secretary for ICE named Ron Vitello. This was 2018. Trump was in the White House, and border security was a priority. Not for Kamala and company, however. There is no such thing as illegal. People cannot be illegal. But there is such a thing as a white supremacist, and it turns out that they're all Border Patrol agents. Take a listen.
Klan was what we would call today a domestic terrorist group.
Why? Why would we call them domestic terrorist group?
Because they tried to use fear and force to change political environment.
And what was the motivation for the use of fear and force?
It was based on race and ethnicity.
Right. Are you aware of the perception of many about how the power and the discretion at ICE is being used to enforce the laws? And do you see any parallels?
I do not see any parallels between
I'm talking about perception.
officers and agents.
I'm talking about perception.
I do not see a parallel between what is constitutionally mandated as it relates to enforcing the law.
Are you aware that there's a perception?
I see no
Are you aware that there's a
that
perception?
puts ICE in the same category as the KKK. Is that what you're asking me?
No, I'm very specific about what I'm asking you. Are you aware of a perception that the way that the discretion
I see no parallel.
I'm not finished.
I see none.
I'm not finished. I'm not finished. Are you aware that there's a perception that ICE is administering its power in a way that is causing fear and intimidation, particularly among immigrants and specifically among immigrants coming from Mexico and Central America? Are you aware of that perception?
I do not see a parallel between the power and the authority that ICE has to do its job and the agents and officers who do it professionally and excellently with lots of compassion.
Sir, how can you be the head of an agency and be unaware of how your agency is perceived by certain communities?
There is a lot of perceptions in the media and in the public that are incorrect about the agency.
But the perception exists, would you agree? Whether or not it's correct. And wouldn't you agree then that if that perception exists, there might need to be some work done to correct the perception?
I do want to advocate for the workforce, the vital public safety mission that they have to protect the homeland. And I think more people need to know how valuable they are to the society. So I agree with you on that.
So I understand your point that you want to defend the honor of the good men and women who work in the agency. And I appreciate that point, and I know the vast majority of the men and women who work in the agency do a noble and good job. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the perception.
Kamala doesn't say ICE is the KKK. She just insinuates as much by ascribing the aspersion to unnamed people who have this perception, and ICE should be very concerned about correcting it, if indeed it's inaccurate, which it may or may not be. As I said, uncut sentimentality. It's a powerful drug. It induces people to give in to unreason in preparation for the unkindness required to enforce it. Our guest on this episode has tackled this topic recently. He was also one of the leading skeptics of COVIDians, writing extensively over the last few years about the implications of the mindless sloganeering that cowered so many into supporting destructive mandates and lockdowns, and giving into madness more generally. John Tierney is a contributing editor to the City Journal. He's a former reporter and columnist for the New York Times, and co-author of the book, The Power of Bad, How the Negativity Effect Rules Us and How We Can Rule It. John, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be with you.
So, I call it sentimentality or sophisticated barbarism. The ties that bind these same people together to participate in the cause du jour. And you wrote recently about this, it's a description I haven't heard before. I didn't know there was sort of a psychiatric title that was applied to this phenomenon, the March of Dimes syndrome. It's termed. Can you provide some color on that?
Yeah, it's something that it was named after a very worthwhile organization, the March of Dimes, but when it was founded, its sole purpose was to conquer polio. And so after the polio vaccines came out, it had accomplished its mission, but it didn't go out of business. It then started fighting birth defects, which is another worthy cause. But what I found is that this same symptom, it afflicts all these radical groups, all these protest movements. And I think most of the protests that you see today, most of the big issues in the news, are due to activists who have already achieved their original goals, and yet so they have to find something new to do. And unfortunately, many of their new goals, they may have started out with worthy goals like the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, and they achieved everything they wanted. And so, but to stay in business, to keep their jobs, to keep raising money, they have to start inventing new ones. And so it wasn't enough. The civil rights movement, in the 1960s, they achieved, they got rid of Jim Crow. They achieved voting rights, housing rights as far as ending discrimination there. We got the civil rights law. And so once that happened, they'd achieved everything that the NAACP put in its mission statement back in 1909 when it was formed. But the movement didn't shut down. They immediately started declaring new things where they had to have racial quotas. They had to have affirmative action. And they did this, even though at the time in the 1960s, blacks had been, they've been the victims of a Jim Crow system for decades. Most blacks were opposed to affirmative action in hiring and in college admissions because they knew this would stigmatize anyone who got a job or who got admitted. But it was something for the movement to do. And they also pivoted where, it suddenly wasn't enough to have equal rights before the law. And now you had to have massive favoritism, and you also had to have massive government spending. So you started with the war on poverty and the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, and there's just been this enormous amount of money, trillions of dollars spent on the war on poverty, and it hasn't really accomplished much. It actually hurt blacks in many ways, but it's been great for the movement because they kept their jobs, they kept being able to raise money. And the election of Barack Obama was a real problem for the movement because they've been saying America's this horribly racist country, and yet they just voted to elect a black man. So it was shortly after Obama's election that you started seeing this obsession with blacks being killed by police, which, there are only, a dozen or so annually unarmed blacks killed by the police. And the studies have repeatedly shown there's no racial pattern to it as far as that goes. But this gave them something, gave a new cause, and journalists were eager to seize on something. So the Black Lives Matter movement started, and that just became another fundraising bonanza. There was something like $10 billion donated to Black Lives Matter related causes. So it was it provided all these jobs and DEI, all this stuff. And so you see this over and over again in other movements. The gay rights movement started out, they wanted to overturn sodomy laws. They wanted to destigmatize homosexuality, and they succeeded. The gay pride flies everywhere. Gays used to be taboo on network television. Now gay characters are practically obligatory. And then, so after they achieved those goals and all the anti-sodomy laws were overturned, then they set a goal of gay marriage, and they achieved that. And so there was really not much left for them to do. So the movement expanded, so it became LGBTQ. They started they became obsessed with transgender stuff. And so now it was no longer enough that Americans, the gay marriage is legal everywhere. Most Americans approved of it, or at least tolerated it, certainly. Suddenly now you had to force conservative Christians to bake cakes and design the websites. Kids had to have access in elementary school libraries to how-to manuals for gay sex. I mean, they keep moving the goalposts is what happens. And you see that over and over again with these movements.
Well, sure. And why wouldn't they, right? I mean, there's always new territory to conquer. And frankly, there's always another perceived or identified marginalized group to add to your coalition to grow your ability to essentially clear the next hurdle, right? I mean, Rusty Reno over at First Things refers to it as solidarity and marginality. And that's what it is. And it seems to me it helps explain why, well, wait a second, the obvious one that's current, Queers for Palestine, right? You understand how gay people would be treated by Hamas and Palestinians generally, but actually that doesn't matter because I'm in solidarity with the Ivy League kids in the 10 cities, and they're in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter guys looting and sacking American cities. And so the more that we let, it's sort of one for all and all for one. The more that we're all together, then when it comes around for our turn, they'll back my play, and then I'll get a little more slice of the power. I'll get a little bit more of the spoils of war in that moment, just as they're getting a little bit more of the spoils of war now.
Right. Yeah. There are these alliances, and as you've said before, and that, I mean, the heritage of this stuff about victimhood and the marginalized people. I mean, it goes back to Marx, where they were going to rescue the proletariat, the poor working man. Then, of course, it turned out that the communism and socialism hurt the working man. So they then had to start inventing new groups to be fighting for. We have to find new marginalized groups to be protecting. And of course, when you are protecting a marginalized group, you're raising money to get yourself a job doing it. You're also fighting to get political power. So you can then, I'm protecting them, and I'm going to seize all this power for me and my allies. We'll gain political power, and then we can start ordering other people around. We can start taking money from taxpayers and giving it to our causes. So that's been going on by the left forever. And, you just see how this, when I first noticed this, it was, I covered the first big anti-nuclear march in Washington, in 1979, right after the 3 Mile Island accident, and right after Jane Fonda's movie, The China Syndrome. And what amazed me, and I was a young reporter in Washington, and I just dimly became aware in interviewing the people doing the march that they were all veterans of the Vietnam War movement. And basically, the Vietnam War had ended. They needed a new gig, so they suddenly, and Jane Fonda was out there doing her thing, and Tom Hayden. They needed a new gig now that the war was over, so that's what they did.
Right, and it's so. This is maybe something you have to realize. First of all, it's all on a continuum, and it's inexhaustible. Right, it cannot be satiated. So the quote unquote sexual revolution, as it was termed in 1968, or the late 60s. I'm always one to point out. I mean, it was the title of a book by Wilhelm Reich, a part of the Frankfurt School, 45 years earlier. So it's on a continuum, and so now we're now into the gender bending phase of this continuum. Affirmative action. It's on a continuum. Affirmative action was to create equality of opportunity on the front end. Now we're past that, and we have to create equality of the outcome on the back end. And that means people need more up front, and people need more on the back end to make sure we all end up in the same place. They're a little unclear what that same place is or how we're all going to end up there. But I mean, you see how this builds upon itself over time. It's not stop and start, stop and start. It's always it's ongoing, and I don't think people have an appreciation for that.
Right. Well, it's like a business. Businesses have to stay in business. You got to keep selling products, and so when one product becomes obsolete, you got to find a new one. And that's what's been going on with them, where and they choose these things. I mean, the whole idea of affirmative action and that we have to have equal outcomes. I mean, it's an activist dream in a way, because as long
It's
as
an
there are
impossibility.
differences among. Right. I mean, there are differences among people there. In every occupation you look in, there's some groups that are there more, but for various reasons. But so as long as there's any difference, they've got they've got a new product to sell. We've got to help somebody, and we've got to pass some law. We've got to get some money. We've got to do something, and gain some power to fix this problem. They'll always have it.
Well, and you've seen this. I mean, race is just the example I'm going to use, but in part because my friend Will Riley wrote a book on it called The Hate Crime Hoax. But the point is, and it's not been made by him exclusively, is that the less racist society becomes, the more the need to invent instances of racism to keep the business going, to use your metaphor. and so you have the Jussie Smollett case, and then everybody rushes. And hey, if that doesn't check out, then we just walk past it, pretend it didn't happen, and we're on to the next one. Because we have to continue to search. I mean, it's like a shark continuing to look for food, right? You just have to continue to search for the next opportunity. And if you, if you make a mistake, then you just ignore it and move on, because you have a lot of sort of infrastructure that will help you ignore it and move on.
Exactly. And the interesting thing, and this is something that I learned when I was researching this article for City Journal, is I mean, I had seen for a while how the activists always do this. They're always moving on like a shark, as you say. But what I didn't, the interesting thing too, is that the appetite, the market for them among the public gets better too, because the better that everything gets, the richer people become, the freer people become, the more educated they become, the more time and disposable income the people have to want to do good. They want to save someone. And so, there are fewer and fewer people who need to be saved now, because, life has gotten so much better for most people on Earth. But you've got all these people that want to save someone. So they're desperately, and the Jussie Smollett has been said, that the demand for racism vastly exceeds the supply. That's why they have to admit it. And the interesting thing that I found out was that famous 19th century Victorian sociologist Herbert Spencer, and it's been dubbed Spencer's Law, because he noticed that the big social movements of his time were about mandatory education for kids, temperance laws, taking care of the poor, feeding people. But what he noticed was that these problems had all been really bad, at the start of the 1900s in England. In the late 1800s, there was mass illiteracy. People were hungry. Kids were working in factories, and most of those problems improved. They improved dramatically. Kids were all going to school. They were learning to read. Most people in England were by the end of the century. But it was at the end of the century, after people were, they had better incomes, better jobs. They were literate. They were and alcoholism had declined dramatically. That's when the temperance movement, that's when all these do-good movements happen, because, and part of it is that once most people are well off, it becomes more glaring, there's somebody who's left out here, whereas before everybody had that problem, but now it's just a few people, so we tend to focus, and it's the way our human brains work, and in The Power of Bad, the book we wrote about the negativity bias, and really interesting experiments that have been done showing that as things get better, as something disappears, we start looking harder and harder for negative things. That as things get better, we look harder to find negative things, because our brain is so wired to focus on the negative. We're always looking for threats. And so when these activists, when this shark goes along and it's always looking for a new thing, it's also got more and more people willing to, to buy these hoaxes, these racist hoaxes, and all the other things that the activists are selling.
Yeah, and maybe that wouldn't be so problematic if this was just sort of dilettantism. But it's the old saw about beware of the man who wants to save humanity, right? So that's what you see, and it's interesting. You say sort of our brains are wired this way. The sort of the search for negativity. The closer we get, the farther away we are. Well, then does it necessarily follow that the decline of great powers is inevitable because you become, to borrow the phrase, you become a victim of your own success. So, barring some sort of, I don't know, religious reawakening, this is the track that the West is on, particularly America.
There's something to that where, I mean, the problem, is safetyism. That you become obsessed with every little threat you could face, and so you basically stop doing anything new because you're so afraid. You're so aware of something might go wrong here. I mean, and the problem is, I mean, it's nice that people want to help other people, and it's great if they do it through volunteer groups, through their personal efforts to help people. But the problem is that these activists often exploit that desire to help people, but with causes that really that hurt society, and they actually go against the original goal. I mean, that the gay rights movement was very became very accepted. It achieved all these victories, and then it's gotten into this transgender stuff, and trying to sterilize children, and so people, it's been bad for the original, and many gays and lesbians are opposed to this stuff because it puts the whole movement in a bad light, and it's made people, it's been a setback in that sense for gay rights because they've embraced these crazy charges. And the other thing that happens, I mean, Jane, and I call it the Jane the Jane Fonda syndrome, or the March of Jane syndrome, which is, Jane Fonda, when she started, she did the anti-war thing against Vietnam, then she shifted to anti-nukes. And then and she probably did as much as anyone through her movie and through her activism to cripple the nuclear industry in the United States. And of course, that led to lots more coal plants being built in the ensuing decades, led to more carbon emissions. And so now, that made worse the problem of carbon emissions, but that gave her a whole new cause. Her current thing now is she has fire drill Fridays, and she's a big leader against carbon emissions, and she helped create that problem. She basically made work for herself doing it. And someone from the Huffington Post, very sympathetic lefty outfit, interviewed her, and they kind of delicately asked her, "Do you have any second thoughts about me, trying to shut down that?" And goes, "No, it was the right message. No second thoughts. Never apologize. Just go on with the gig."
Right after she's done tackling climate change, she'll tackle the tomahawk chop at Braves games. She's going to work on that next. I mean, it is remarkable. You mentioned safetyism, and I did want to get to your book review of the sainted Tony Fauci's memoir On Call, and just his, speaking of Jane Fonda being unapologetic, Tony Fauci channeling Jane Fonda, he did nothing wrong. There's nothing he would do differently based on the information he had at the time throughout the COVIDian period. He did everything as good as it could be done.
It's just unbelievable what he's gotten away with. And the appalling thing is his book, his memoir, has been #1 on the Times bestseller list some weeks. And he had no apologies in it, no nothing. And he's been doing this his whole career. He was at the start of the AIDS epidemic, he was one of the people warning that AIDS is going to spread among heterosexuals. It's going to be this huge, that we all have to be terribly concerned. He helped Surgeon General Koop publish his booklet warning that heterosexuals were all at risk. And this was a bonanza for Fauci. He got huge budget increases in his work, but but it terrified the whole population for many years. I think a couple decades this went on until people finally realized it's not really spreading among heterosexuals. And he's done this just repeatedly. The swine flu, the bird flu, these were all going to be devastating pandemics. And so it would be great for Fauci. He'd be on the media all the time. He'd be getting lots of money, huge budget appropriations to deal with these pandemics that never arrived. And then, of course, he stoked so much fear. And there was always going to be, we have to prepare for this killer new Black Plague, new Spanish flu that's going to come, that they started funding this research, this gain of function research in China and elsewhere. And now, in all likelihood, the overwhelming likelihood is that basically that it was the fear of that, the fear that Fauci helped stoke, that led to the COVID pandemic, because they paid for that research that created the virus uh, in the Wuhan lab. I mean, it's terrible, terrible outcome, but very good for Tony Fauci, and he has no apologies. He's selling books. He's he's collecting ungodly fees for his lectures. It's been a great gig for him.
And frankly, for the public health establishment, you haven't seen too many people that I can think of that have offered any second thoughts on what we did. Yeah, some people say if we had to do it again, I wouldn't do lockdowns, or next time around, I wouldn't do lockdowns. I wouldn't close the schools. So you've had some more recognition there because of the overwhelming evidence of how negative the impact was on children's socio-intellectual development, combined with how little protection that really offered them. But for the most part, it's been, skulk quietly away from the crime scene.
Yeah, no, it's just, memory hold. And, the media was so shameless and scaring people. It was great for them. They got big ratings, lots of clicks. There was one paper, I think it was in Denmark, that actually did apologize to its readers and said, we were wrong about this. We shouldn't have done it. And there have been, some government officials in Europe, have said, we were wrong. We did too much. We should have done what Sweden did, which is let life go on, protect the elderly, and let life go on for the rest of them. But otherwise, Rachel Walensky, the CDC director, she went and said our problem, and Fauci actually, said this in his book too, that we should have done more early, which is exactly the opposite of what, they should have done less. They should have done some different things early, like really protecting elderly people, not sending them, into nursing homes if they were infected. But the CDC wants more money and more power next time. They've been, the WHO, the World Health Organization, wants a pandemic treaty that would institutionalize this stuff around the world. It's just appalling how they don't pay a price for this, except on enlightened programs like yours.
Yes, well, we try, actually, it's infuriating just to hear you repeat it. We should have done more early. Right. That's sort of the throwaway. Like, it sounds like, if we could only been more proactive. And so we should be more proactive next time by, as you say, getting more cash in house right now. Yeah. and so nothing specific. We should have just done more, generally speaking, early. And he talks like a politician, because that's the way that he and so many of these public health professionals behaved. And I just wonder, if there'll be any hesitation the next go around, and who knows when that may be. But any hesitation from these institutions or the people from these academic institutions or the institutions themselves to say, don't get over your skis this time around like you did last time around.
Yeah, the whole establishment was involved in this, and they have no desire to do it. There's some hope if Republicans get Congress, in the Senate, that they would do an investigation. And if there's a Republican president, then, he might do something. There's a little problem with Trump in that his instincts, were pretty good on this. And he brought in Scott Atlas, one of the skeptics of the lockdown. But, he didn't fire Fauci. And so, DeSantis was attacking him for that, justifiably, I think. But, but DeSantis isn't around. And so I don't know how much Trump wants to talk about it. But Scott Atlas told me that he thought Trump did take the right lessons from the pandemic and understood what went wrong. So if it happened on his watch, he wouldn't do this again. And maybe he'll try and put in some, this Project 2025 that the Heritage Foundation is doing, that, of course, if you listen to the Democrats, you think it's the, second coming, or it's the Fourth Reich coming, right, when in fact, most of what it does is it's trying to reduce the power of the federal government. And they do have some very good proposals for taking away the power of these federal agencies, decentralizing. One of the reasons Fauci was so powerful, he controlled so much money. His agency, had almost a monopoly in a way on public funding for research in infectious disease. So, people were all afraid to speak up against him. And there's some really good ideas that this funding ought to be dispersed to the states so that no one person has that chokehold on it anymore. And basically and proposals that the government can't just declare an emergency endlessly. They've got to justify it. They can't keep claiming these powers. So maybe that will change, but they're never going to apologize on their own, the people that made these mistakes.
John Tierney is a contributing editor to City Journal. He's a former reporter and columnist for the New York Times. His book, The Power of Bad, How the Negativity Effect Rules Us and How We Can Rule It. John, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Dan.
Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.